The Gobi wind did not blow. It scoured. Every gust flung coarse sand into Zhang Wei's eyes, each grain biting like a needle against his skin. He squinted, shielding his face with a forearm, but the grit found every gap. He stumbled, his boots sliding on the shifting dunes, and slammed his shoulder into a rock to steady himself. He reached inward, pressing a hand against his side. The scroll was there, a stiff, rectangular presence against his ribs. It was a heavy, unyielding weight that felt far more substantial than the parchment it actually was. He took a breath, tasting dust and dry heat, and forced his legs to move again. The desert was a vast, indifferent expanse, designed to break men, but he could not afford to break. He checked the horizon, seeing only the endless, undulating waves of sand that seemed to shift with every blink. He adjusted his stance, dug his heels into the slope, and pushed forward. The mission was the only thing keeping him upright. He ignored the stinging in his eyes, ignored the burning in his lungs, and focused entirely on the next step. The scroll stayed pressed against him. He kept his eyes locked on the path ahead. Zhang Wei crested the dune, and the caravan came into view. A thin, golden ribbon snaking through the heat haze. It looked impossibly delicate against the vast, brutal landscape. Bales of silk caught the sun, shimmering with a richness. Beside them, crates of ceramics rattled with every uneven step of the pack animals, a sound of potential ruin that made Zhang Wei wince. The caravan was a fortune on legs, a target that invited greed from every shadow. He moved down the slope to join the line. The guards were struggling. They walked with their heads low, sweat carving tracks through the dust on their faces. Their hands were locked onto the stocks of their crossbows, knuckles white and strained. They did not talk. They did not look at the scenery. They watched the perimeter with a predatory focus, their movements stiff and heavy. Every time a pack animal stumbled, the entire line froze. Zhang Wei walked the length of the line, checking the tension in the ropes, feeling the fragility of the entire operation. The rhythm of the march was hypnotic, a steady, grinding cycle of boot falls and the dry rasp of shifting sand. Zhang Wei kept his pace, his eyes scanning the undulating dunes that stretched toward the horizon. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the caravan, until the air itself seemed to thicken and blur. Then, the rhythm broke. A flicker of light caught his eye, a sharp, unnatural glint that did not belong to the sun or the sand. It was a cold, metallic flash. He stopped. His hand moved instinctively to the hilt at his side, his fingers tightening. He squinted, holding his breath. This time, it was not a single glint, but a series of them, dancing along the crest of the distant dune. The air suddenly felt charged. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the ground. A wall of dust rose up, obscuring the sky, and silhouettes materialized. The danger was a closing distance, a wave of motion rushing toward them. Zhang Wei stood frozen, watching the steel flash again. Zhang Wei's voice cut through the rising roar of the approaching horses. He bellowed the order, his lungs straining against the dry heat. "Circle the wagons! Spears out!" The command hit the guards like a physical force. They abandoned the line, sprinting toward the center of the caravan. Wagons were shoved into place with desperate, frantic strength, their wheels grinding deep into the loose sand. The guards moved with a sudden, sharp precision, abandoning the exhaustion of the march for the cold logic of survival. They slammed their heavy rectangular shields together, a wall of wood and metal forming in seconds. The sound was a rhythmic, bone-jarring clack. Each man locked his shield into the next, creating a solid, impenetrable barrier. The bandits were closer now, the thundering of hooves vibrating. He stood behind the line, watching the horizon vanish behind a wall of charging figures. The raiders were a chaotic wave, screaming and kicking up grit. The guards braced their feet, leaning their weight into the shields, their knuckles white. The silence was gone, replaced by the pulse of the charge. The collision arrived with a sickening thud of wood against wood. Then came the sound that cut through the shouting, the high-pitched whistle of bone-tipped arrows slicing the air. A storm of them arched over the dunes, raining down on the defensive circle. The guards ducked, but the shields groaned under the relentless, rhythmic impact. Every strike sent a vibration through the line. To Zhang Wei's left, a guard stiffened. An arrow had found the vulnerable gap at his throat. The man dropped his shield, his hands clawing at the shaft before he collapsed into the sand. The wall was breached. A gap opened, exposing the interior of the circle to the charging raiders. Zhang Wei did not hesitate. He lunged forward, his boots crunching into the blood-soaked sand. He stepped directly into the opening, his body filling the space where the guard had stood seconds before. The air was thick with the scent of iron and kicked-up dust. He drew his blade, the steel straight and cold in his grip. He planted his feet, shifting his weight to hold the line. The raiders were feet away, their horses foaming, their eyes locked on the opening he had just claimed. He stood firm, his lungs pulling in the hot, dry air, waiting. The first rider lunged, his lance leveled at Zhang Wei's chest. Zhang Wei did not retreat. He stepped inside the arc of the weapon, his blade rising in a sharp, controlled sweep. Steel rang against steel as he parried the lance, knocking the tip wide. The momentum of the horse carried the rider forward, exposing the animal's flank. Zhang Wei pivoted, his blade finding the unprotected chest of the beast. The horse stumbled, its legs buckling under the sudden weight. As the rider tumbled toward the sand, Zhang Wei did not pause. He shifted his stance, his blade tracing a lethal arc through the air. The steel found the exposed neck of the next attacker before the man could raise his own weapon. The bandit collapsed. Zhang Wei stood over the fallen, his movements devoid of wasted energy. The momentum of their charge died in the dust. Zhang Wei saw the hesitation in the eyes of the raiders. They were disorganized, their initial fury spent against the wall of shields. He roared a single command, his voice cutting through the chaotic din of the desert. The defensive circle shattered. The guards did not retreat. They pivoted. With practiced mechanical synchronization, they locked their shields into a sharp, forward-facing point. The wedge formation took shape in an instant, a spear-tipped arrow of men and steel. Zhang Wei led the charge, his boots finding purchase in the shifting sand. They surged forward, not as individuals but as a single unstoppable mass. The impact was instantaneous. The wedge slammed into the center of the raiding party, tearing through their thin line with brutal efficiency. The raiders, lacking the discipline to withstand a heavy infantry push, lost their footing. Horses reared and collided, blocking each other's paths. The bandits panicked. They turned their mounts away, desperate to escape the relentless pressure of the advancing wedge. Within seconds, the formation had driven deep into the heart of the enemy, forcing them to scatter into the dunes. The threat dissolved into a cloud of dust and retreating hooves. The roar of the charge faded into the vast, empty silence of the Gobi. Only the ragged, uneven breathing of the survivors remained, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Zhang Wei walked the perimeter, his boots crunching against the sand, which had turned a dark, heavy shade of red. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the ground for threats that no longer existed. He stopped near the edge of the formation. A guard lay motionless, face pressed into the grit. Zhang Wei knelt beside him, the movement stiff and deliberate. He reached down, his fingers brushing the sand to retrieve a stray bolt that had missed its mark. He held it up, watching the light catch the metal, then wiped the blood from the shaft with a piece of cloth. The weight of the mission pressed down on him. This was the true price of the trade route, a ledger written in lives rather than silk or gold. He stood, his joints protesting the movement, and looked out over the dunes. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around his feet, erasing the tracks of the battle as if it had never occurred. The desert remained indifferent to the blood spilled in its name. Zhang Wei stood alone for a moment longer, letting the silence settle into his bones. The heat of the day was bleeding out of the sand, replaced by a sharp, biting chill that signaled the coming night. He turned his back on the fallen and walked toward the center of the caravan. His voice was a low, steady rasp that cut through the heavy air. Secure the perimeter. Salvage the remaining bolts. We move by the stars. The men stirred, their movements sluggish but obedient. They began to clear the debris, gathering the scattered supplies and checking the axles of the wagons. Zhang Wei watched them, his eyes tracking every movement, ensuring the formation was tight and ready. He felt the weight of the scroll against his ribs, a constant, rigid reminder of the purpose that drove them forward. As the last of the sun dipped below the dunes, the first stars pricked through the darkening sky. Zhang Wei signaled the lead driver. The caravan began to creak into motion, a slow, rhythmic grinding of wood against grit. He took his place at the front, his stride measured and deliberate. He stared toward the western horizon, where the path remained long and unforgiving. He kept his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his resolve as hard and unyielding as the desert floor beneath his feet.